Recently, I've seen several folks online arguing that St. Paul didn't even exist, and that his letters were 4th century fraud. For some reason, this absurdity keeps making the rounds, and there are far too many people who buy into it. The latest person I encountered suggested that they could have been written as late as the 7th century because Koine Greek extended between the 2nd century BCE to the 7th century CE. The constant error behind this is that those who make this claim don't understand the language in which they were written, or how language changes over time. 500 years, give or take, is generally when two stages of a language become mutually unintelligible, though it becomes a lot tougher around 400. The truth is, 7th century CE is pushing it a lot. 7th century Greek would be unintelligible to a 1st century speaker, and would at the very least be very, very different. The Greek of the New Testament is definitely what was spoken between the 1st and 2nd centuries. You can tell this by comparing it with other 1st century and early 2nd century writings in the Koine, such as Epictetus and the early church patristics like the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, and others. You have to take language change into account, even within the same language. To say that the New Testament could have been written in the 4th century, much less the 7th, doesn't take into account the change in the language over time, as well as regional accents and dialects. It's like saying Chaucer could have been written in the 1900s, because English has technically been spoken since the 900s or even earlier. I would draw your attention to the Book of Mormon as an illustration of an obvious linguistic forgery. It attempts greatly to mimic the language of the King James Version, but any honest comparison of the two would conclude that the author of the former doesn't actually know how to wield the Elizabethan form of the language, and it comes off as completely erroneous. The only way anyone can conclude that the New Testament was not written in the 1st century is if they had never actually read it in the original Greek, and had never compared it, and had never compared any other Greek texts from various periods and regions either. I have. I assure you, they are very different. I've been doing it for 30 years. The writings of Paul are 1st century, and all written or dictated by the same person. I will put forth as an example the original Greek form of the Philokalia. This is the second most important book of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and is a series of mystical and theological essays and spiritual reflections written in Greek over a period between the 5th century CE and the 15th century CE by multiple religious and monastics across the Orthodox spectrum. Excuse me. The Greek in which it was written is diverse from beginning to end as it moves from late Koine into Byzantine and the proto-form of what is now modern Greek. My point to all of this is that you can tell what period a text was written in simply by comparing the form of the language to other texts, in the same way that you can tell what period an English text was written in, whether it was Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, Elizabethan, 18th century, or present-day 21st century English. You can also tell from what region the speaker or writer came by the idioms, spellings, and choices of vocabulary. It's not hard to distinguish J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter from Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. It's also not hard to distinguish Jane Eyre from the original text of Beowulf. Even C.S. Lewis's writing style can be distinguished from J.R.R. Tolkien's, and they were contemporaries, friends, and colleagues in roughly the same sociolinguistic landscape. Paul's writing is distinct from all the other New Testament authors, but it is clearly written by a single author who lived in the 1st century, was clearly educated in the Greek classics and Roman Stoic worldview, as well as of a distinctly 1st century Jewish education and identity. Everything from the internal evidence of his letters pinpoints the mid-1st century and largely the Eastern Mediterranean. Could they have been faked at a much later date? Honestly, I can't see how. These letters were known by the patristic fathers and mentioned by them as far back as the late 1st century, as was Paul. No one in the first 3 centuries of Christianity ever actually questioned their authenticity. There were a number of writings which were questioned, even within the canon New Testament, but Paul's never actually were, and they were among the earliest to be translated to Aramaic in the 2nd century, if memory serves at all. Excuse me. Finally, Paul's letters are personal from beginning to end, and they're personal in a way that strikes of authenticity. One would have to be a very talented novelist to be able to express this much authentic emotion through the words of the original 1st century Greek. They would have had to not only fake Paul's letters, but most of the book of Acts in which Paul's story was told, and as such the Gospel of Luke as well, which is written in the exact same style, dialect, and accent as Acts. They would also have had to really had down Paul's movements and the 1st century historical figures mentioned in them, to such an extent as to be able to authentically write and keep track of where he was writing from, and the events surrounding the period in which he was writing. This would have been a massive scholarly undertaking, considering it would have had to be written in at least 2 different styles and dialects of the language which no longer existed by the 4th century, much less the 5th, and if not dialects, and accents at least. If you've ever read anything about medieval forgeries, they just weren't that clever. Honestly, it takes less faith to believe these writings are exactly what they purport to be, as the preponderance of internal evidence is just rabidly against their being a fraud. Whether one agrees with St. Paul or not, whether they understand what he was really writing and saying, there is really just no other conclusion that can be drawn except that they were written when they say they were, by whom they say they were, and to whom they say they were. Any suggestion otherwise just betrays an utter ignorance of the language, the time period, and every other factor involved, all for the sake of ignoring what the reader perceives to be what Paul meant. And just to add to this, that is what this is really about. People are upset about what Paul said, and they're upset about what they think he said about judgment. They're upset about what they think he said about being forgiven or not. And really, all that has to do with is translation. All that has to do with is understanding where he was coming from, and understanding that modern translations of what he wrote are all keyed to a very specific theological they're all geared for a very specific theology, in particular Protestant theology. And the reason for that is because it was largely all Protestants, and in particular evangelical Protestants over the last several hundred years, who have been doing the translating. When you actually get back into the language, when you actually start looking up what these words mean, and in particular what they meant outside of any religious texts, or what would be considered religious texts, you start coming to some very different conclusions about what Paul meant. And it's not what a lot of people think. Paul's letters were written by Paul. There is no other conclusion. And it does matter what language you read them in. A lot of the things about this are not, you don't discover and really nail down a lot of this until you start really becoming acquainted with and familiar with the original text of the New Testament. Translations just won't reveal a lot of this.